This is update for May 21, 2023. Also catch up for May 20. This is day 452 of the war, end of the date update. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about China. There's some polling information become available. I don't know to what extent it is propaganda, but that's all sort of we have, and this is basically information on the how Chinese are perceiving Taiwan, and so the results are pretty concerning. So 56% of Chinese want to invade and basically conquer Taiwan, um, and in other question, um, sort of how many of them are willing to accept coexistence of two systems. I think 71% don't accept, only 22% accept coexistence. So basically, really, people who want to sort of have peaceful life is essentially only 22%. So it's not sort of looking good very clearly. Also, in Taiwan, as I said before, there is no unity in the society itself. It's pretty split. Um, and there was, I think, incident recently with uh, Taiwanese athlete who was participating in Taekwondo tournament, and I think he won or something. He was one of the sort of winners there, and he came with Chinese flag. So this kind of tells you the situation with Taiwan is extremely, I would say, uncertain. Uh, also, have some. I found some information on the Chinese Navy and sort of expectation. Obviously, this is U.S. expectations. What how Chinese Navy is going to be developing. But the most interesting part here is that it doesn't look like China is planning to develop its aircraft carrier fleet. As you can see, right now they have three essentially. By 2040, they're going to have six, which not enough. I mentioned before, U.S. has about 11, I believe. And they are definitely much better than what China has. I think I made a video about 2 months ago. So it looks like what the China is basing its strategy is to increasing number of cruisers and destroyers. As you can see, essentially they're going to double, and then increasing significantly frigates and corvettes by about 40%. So that's their focus. Um, So this, but this is okay with a grain of salt. This is U.S. Perception of what China is going to do, and doesn't mean that that's exactly what's going to happen. But this approach very clearly sort of shows that China is basically trying to project its power basically in this Pacific region and also Indian Ocean. There's no plans to sort of for immediate sort of global um, conquest. Let's put this way, and maybe they will never be. But it's very clear that China is planning to dominate completely this uh, Pacific region and also this eastern part of the Indian Ocean and all the way to the Persian Gulf because they want to secure supply of crude oil, right? So this is what's happening there. Now let's switch quickly to the U.S. banking system. I showed this chart, which was showing the stress. The stress remains in the system since the beginning of the March. As you can see, it's didn't go away. I have a little bit more information just to kind of give you a little bit more color. So I mentioned about this interest rate. Um, for this was it bank term funding program, right? This is orange line here, as you can see. But the really to measure stress, you need to sum. It's a summation of all three programs, uh, but uh, but because the others they have sort of fixed interest rates, so there is no way to gauge the situation with the sort of how desperately banks need the fund, the resources based on interest rate. So the only way is to look at the bank term funding program where it looks like it's actually fluctuates. And as you can see, based on that, the if you look just at the interest rate, it seems like the stress is on the higher end in the system, right? Because that's where we are right now, based on the information. And then another sort of supporting or corroborating piece of evidence, if we look at the deposits in the U.S. banking system, as you can see, they clearly going down. There was a little bit of uptick, and then it's just resumes downward trajectory. As you can see, this is where it's all going. It's unadjusted deposits. So I'm gonna make it clear. It's seasonally unadjusted deposits here pictured. So how they interrelated is basically if banks don't have deposits, that's a hole, and they need to cover it, and they go and borrow under this what's it called, bank term funding program. That's what it is. So basically, they all work together, right? The fewer deposits they have, the more they need to borrow from the Federal Reserve, and they borrow through this BDFP basically, and that's why the interest rate goes up, because more and more banks want to have it, and so the interest because it's a supply and demand situation. Even technically, probably Federal Reserve can make it um, uh, sort of available at lower interest rate. But the key here is that banks are borrowing for a year, and they have to pay, let's say, 5% interest on that borrowing, so which makes it very expensive for them. So this is, as I said before, it's just a band-aid that doesn't solve the problem, because banks don't generate 5% on revenue or interest revenue, because that's the income on the loans that they have, that they lend, on the money that they lend. They at best generate, like, let's say 3-4%. So this basically staves off bankruptcy, but it doesn't even stabilize the system. Basically, it just as I said before, the only way to stabilize the system is to reduce interest rates, because the loans that banks have made uh, pay too little interest to banks, so they cannot afford to have high interest rate in the economy in general. And so this is the basic sort of essence of this whole problem. And as long as those interest rates are going to be high, the deposits are going to go away from the banks, because the reason, because just to understand the whole how the whole system works, is banks because banks earn too little, because they lend out money to the borrowers at very low interest rates, let's say 2-3%, whatever, 3.5, because that's what they collect, right, as income from the borrowers. So, and then they are just intermediary. Then they turn back and they, you know, pay money to the depositors who give the money to the banks, right? And then, because the intermediary, they also collect something for themselves, for their own profit and sort of their operations. And because they don't earn enough, right? So they cannot pay their depositors as well. And so they offer very little on deposits, and so depositors are leaving banking system, and they going and putting money in treasuries, basically U.S. short-term treasuries, which pay 5.2%, 5.25% for I think 3 months. So this is the highest interest rate in the entire financial system, and it's nearly guaranteed, obviously, with caveat of the problems with this debt ceiling, but that is really not a problem. It's just more of a show, let's put this way, that's happening. But U.S. is going to be able to pay um, its debts from the revenue. There's I won't say enough revenue, but there's enough revenue to cover debt payment, basically basic necessities. Let's put this way. Uh, if you look at if you change it to like a family budget, you have enough money for all of the necessities that you have, like required payments. You just don't have enough money to to do extravagant things, and maybe not even extravagant, but like to go to restaurants or to do expensive vacation. Yeah, you don't have money for that, but U.S. totally earns money to cover its basic needs. There's definitely not a problem there, and obviously paying interest in is included in those basic needs. So again, this is that's why I'm saying it's more of a show than sort of. I would say it is a problem in the long run. There's no question about it. But at this moment, at this specific instance, it's more of a political show than anything else. Now let's move to Ukraine. Actually, let me mention something very sort of related to all of this that I didn't discuss prior to this, and this is actually related to China. So so when China exports its goods to the U.S., what happens is they don't have enough of interest from the to import to buy in the U.S. basically, right? So it's a huge difference, huge gap what China sells to U.S. versus what it buys from the U.S. Obviously in the favor of China. So what as a result they get a lot of U.S. dollars, right? And there are other countries sort of in similar situations, such as Germany, Japan, and South Korea. All of those sort of manufacturing exporters, similar to China. So what those and actually Russia was another country that was in the same ballpark. What those all of these countries that were selling on the international market and getting a lot of dollars, what they were doing, they were just basically sending dollars back to the U.S. by buying a U.S. government debt, right? So it's kind of like a full circle, right? They get that money from the U.S., but then they send that money back to U.S. by basically lending that money back to U.S. By buying U.S. government debt, which is treasuries, right? So that system worked until actually China got into this, and what China did, they did sort of buy some U.S. government debt, but what they started doing, and this been going on for a while, since like late 2000s at least, they effectively broke this system. They sort of very shrewd, and they figured out like this is doesn't work. This is not in their best interest to do that. And what they did, they actually started um, instead of sending buying U.S. government debt, they were started buying around resources in the world and buying literally governments in the world, more specifically in Africa, then Latin America, in Asia as well. So they were basically in that way they were supplanting U.S. influence, and basically they turned the system that sort of worked very well for the U.S. and actually they blew it up from within, because they diverted all of that money. So it's not going back to us. It actually started going uh, around the world and basically undermining U.S. influence. And so this is what China has been doing for at least, let's say, 15 years, maybe more. Don't know exact numbers, but this is essentially how China undermined U.S. influence in the world, and why right now we see so many countries are sort of quiet and effectively support quietly supporting China, or even starting openly supporting China. And this is the result of all of those activities that's been going on. And plus, if you add to that China can supply manufacturing goods wise what those countries really need to cover their basic needs, they really don't need that much West. They definitely don't need US. And in terms of Europe, they don't need also that much basically, because the knowledge gap that existed between the developing world and developed world shrunk tremendously. Essentially, and it's thanks to China, obviously. Essentially, it's close to be sort of non-existent for the most part, with exception of those advanced semiconductor manufacturing. And so this is the essence of all of this problem, that essentially West is facing, is there is no more knowledge gap that could be used as a leverage to sustain higher standard of living. And this is the whole rift of this whole problem of, you know, conflict between, West on one side, and then Russia, China, and Iran on the other side, right? It's essentially these countries are saying, okay, well, we don't want this existing status quo, the world order. We want to change it and redefine it in our favor, based on, the shrinking knowledge gap and our new manufacturing capabilities. And so this is the basis of all of this conflict. And as you can see, there's not really many sort of resolution to. There's not much in a short term and even medium term. There's not much you can do about this. It's just in a way, it's like objectively, these two blocks are on a collision course. So this is just sort of give you another, how to say, angle of how things are. Now let's actually switch to Ukraine, and we're gonna walk through the front line in a clockwise fashion. So I'm gonna discuss Bakhmut once we get there. So, but first I'll say what's going on along the state border. Nothing major going on in terms of actual sort of Ukrainian offensive, or potential for Ukrainian offensive, or potential for Russian offensive, but there is exchange of artillery fire on both sides. Now let's jump to the North Lugansk front line. Things here are quiet on both sides. As I said before, this is not going to be, or at least I believe this is not going to be area where there will be any large strategic move by either side. Now let's move to North Donbass front line, and obviously this is all about Bakhmut. So as I put on the community board on the 20th, the Ukrainian troops, or Bakhmut fell. Ukrainian troops lost control of Bakhmut. End of the story. There's not much to add to it. Yes, the Ukrainian official side is still having difficulty admitting to it, but that's really actually speaking about the weakness, and that's actually speaks about the problem in the Ukrainian political and military top, that they cannot admit their own mistakes, and this really what this means, that they not gonna fix problems. That's the next sort of logical conclusion out of this. If you're not willing to admit your problem, you will not fix those problems, right? And so that's where the problem, that's the biggest problem out of all of this. Not so much loss of Bakhmut, which is okay, everybody understands its loss, there's no question about it, but it's still not, the Ukrainian military top and political, it all comes from one person, because the Ukrainian president is essentially sort of like a dictator in some shape or form in Ukraine. So everybody waits for him to sort of approve the message, and if they don't get the approval, everybody's sort of scared, doesn't know what to do. And that's obviously, as I said before, that's a part of the, well, that's the main reason why Ukrainian army um, not performing better than the Russian army. That they are both Soviet armies, and that's exactly where what I was talking, that um, the individual person is basically disempowered and paralyzed, and the initiative is punished. So it's that's why there are all of these problems, and that's why Wagner mercenaries did what they did. They achieved, they captured Bakhmut because they are not part of this system where initiative is punished and individual person is disempowered. Um, yeah, the Wagner mercenaries is not a perfect sort of organization or whatever, but like if you look at it from a purely organizational perspective, it's light years ahead of the Soviet army, and so it always will be able to sort of win the Soviet army, and that's unfortunately Ukrainian side. Ukrainian sort of troops are degraded uh, to the level of the Soviet army, and that's a whole big problem. And no, in order to compensate for that weakness, you really need enormous amount of military equipment from the West, which West does not have, and that's a strategic problem that West faces, Ukraine faces. That in order to compensate for this huge, because it's a huge drag on performance, let's put this way, you need to send a lot of equipment, not just 30 Abrams tanks or whatever, 80 Leopard 2 tanks. That's drop in the bucket, let's put this way. And even sending 60 F-16s is not going to change anything at all, because F-16s are basically on par with Su-35. There are anti-air missiles, so they're not gonna be like sort of game changer on the battlefield. Not to mention that that's not what really is needed, really the most. The the problem is that by getting all of this equipment, uh, the solution is basically the Ukraine is not solving the problem, which is at individual level, individual soldier level, and it's organizational problem. It's not equipment problem in the first place. And basically, you're masking the problem by trying to get all of this equipment, advanced equipment, basically trying to say, "Oh, we're gonna get this equipment; it's gonna get better." No, it's not gonna get better, because the problem is within. The problem is not so much about the equipment. The problem is how people are treated extremely poorly, and as long as you don't resolve that, the result is not going to be different. And that's the whole um, crux of the problem that Ukraine is facing. In terms of, let's just quickly look at this Bakhmut situation. In terms of Wagner mercenaries, so there was announcement by the head of, um, I don't know if he is head, but the manager, let's put this way, of the Wagner mercenaries, that they were gonna withdraw on the by May 25th from Bakhmut. It will be taken over by regular Russian troops, and they will be out probably for a couple months for regrouping, refitting, getting new, how to say, mercenaries and so on. And they will come back to the front line at that time. They may be called back very quickly, even if they are not in best shape. If Ukrainian offensive is successful, and you need sort of, how to say, firefighting team. So, but at the same time, their firefighting capabilities are very significantly diminished because they simply exhausted in terms of manpower right now. And just to give you an idea of this sort of economics of the war, economics of Wagner mercenaries, so it actually, to maintain this organization, it takes about, I would say, close to 2 billion US dollars per month. This is you need to understand that they get free ammunition and free heavy military equipment. So basically, artillery, tanks, aircraft, all of that, the heavy equipment they're getting for free from the Russian military, and then individual level equipment they getting their own, and so as you can see, to like for a year of war, like say 12 months, is 24 billion US dollars. It's a lot of money, and the way they work is that they earn that money for the most part around the world. So like one source is Sudan, where um, they basically extract gold there, and then they sell gold from Sudan to the world market. In similar situation in Central Africa, and so on. So this is how they basically. It's in a way, this war machine is being financed by all of this extraction of natural resources, basically from Africa, and then selling them for the most obviously part on the black market. So this is how this works, and as you can imagine, the scale of extraction from Africa is huge, because you obviously Sudan does not cover you cannot get 2 billion US dollars per month from Sudan. So this is many sort of sources, including they have something in Syria as well, I think in Libya. So like basically, as you can imagine, it's very very powerful organization. Let's put this way, that controls significant portion uh, of territory in Africa and in Syria as well, and so on. So this is just gives you idea about the sort of war economics of the Wagner group. Um, Now and then let's just look at this situation and the front line here. So as you can see, the situation is more or less, the front line is straightened right now. So this gives a chance, and as I said before, Ukrainian side is controlling important um, let's say heights. So that allows to kind of like have a decent chance at defending this line and not allowing Russian troops to move westward. And especially since Wagner mercenaries are out, this I think is going to turn into stalemate. And there were some attacks by Russian troops here, as you can see, into areas, but I don't think there will be much out of it. At the same time, when there is some discussion on the Ukrainian side about some kind of encircling Bakhmut or anything like that, it's almost like we're flying to the moon. Basically, it's so far from reality. At this point, it's essentially a draw, where Ukrainian side lost Bakhmut, but is in decent position to hold this new established front line that's more straightened, and where it has more favorable position relative to the Russian side. Plus, you have regular Russian army, which is essentially on par, and even or some marginally worse than the Ukrainian army. So, so essentially, this means that there probably will be some kind of stalemate on this section of the front line, unless there is some, significant change in the quantity of resources on either side, which we'll find out when it happens. But so far, it doesn't look so. This is just how it was sort of happening over time. So again, this is the look at this whole front line. As I said, this is much more. It's not as good. It's not as clear on this map, but on that more precise map, it's much more clear. That it's more straight, and it's as I said, Ukrainian troops are in better position right now to hold to this line. Now let's check central Donbass front line. Things here are more or less the same, a little bit, fewer Russian attacks, but all typical locations: Pisky, Salyan, Marinka, and Avdiivka. So there's no essentially changes here. It's basically status quo. There's no real World War One in its worst, let's put it this way. And then the next one is Zaporizhya front line. Things here are quiet for now, but as I mentioned before, this is the most likely area where Ukrainian command is going to be seeking decisive defeat of the Russian troops. Uh, if this is going to happen, we'll find out. In terms of Ukrainian offensive, it does look it's going to be sometime after May 25th, because Ukrainian president is still going to be out of the country, and as I said before, as you can, he is basically very he's a total micromanager, and has a dictatorship leaning. So nothing is going to happen without him being in Ukraine, and probably even hand holding all of these generals in terms of what they're gonna do. That's all for the day. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye bye.